Okay, so to summarize that beast of a last slide, by the third century, Rome had controlled pretty much all of central and the southern Italian peninsula. They get into a fight with Carthage over Sicily, and in the context of that war, they end up defeating Carthage and controlling much of the Mediterranean world. This leads many people to kind of reflect on the war and to explain or justify it from the Roman side of things. And this is where lots of historians dig into it. And many of these historians are actually kind of Greco-Roman. They're individuals who have been educated and trained in Hellenistic schools, are often caught and captured by Romans and brought to Rome as tutors. And probably the most important figure here is a guy named Polybius. Polybius is around from about 200 to 118 BC. The context in which he writes is obviously Rome has reduced its strongest competitor, Carthage, to insignificance. And at that point, they turn westward and they try and conquer much of the rest of the Hellenistic world. Who's Polybius? Well, he is ethnically Greek. He's captured and he's taken to Rome. And instead of wasting away as a hostage, he emerges kind of first as a tutor to noble Roman boys, then as a client of an important Roman citizen, and under the protection and the supervision of that citizen, he's actually able to travel very widely. He actually is in Carthage with the Roman army when it's destroyed in 146 and watches it firsthand. He writes a text called the Histories, and translating it kind of roughly into English, he calls it a report on Rome's recent past by an outsider who could observe Roman government, military arts, and diplomacy from an extremely favorable position. And I stumbled a lot there, so let me say it again. A report on Rome's recent past by an outsider, so he's trying to present himself objectively, who could observe Roman government, military arts, and diplomacy from an extremely favorable position. So his histories are very loosely focused on the theme of Rome's rise to the status of a great power. He doesn't want to just describe that, though. Instead, he wants to ask why the Romans were successful. And coming from a Greek background, he wants to ask why the Romans are successful when the Greeks aren't. And he comes up basically with a three-part answer. One, Rome has the proper attitudes. Roman character, he says, has traits of statesmanship, perseverance, steadfast purpose. Public figures show steadfastness, clear dedication to the Roman state. The way they treat the defeated people is to incorporate them into their civilization rather than to treat them brutally, more or less. Occasionally there are examples that are meant to dissuade other people from rebelling. And those things seem to make, at least from Polybius's perspective, the Roman state imperialism a lot more enlightened and a lot more stable than anything Hellenistic successor kingdoms had done. Secondly, and probably most importantly, what we're going to draw out in a little bit more, is that Roman political institutions are better suited to ensure social stability than those we have seen in places like Athens. The Greeks had this idea of cycles of birth, rise, acme, highest point, and decay. And this is in terms of both philosophy and in terms of politics, right? So you start low, you go to an apex, and then eventually things get corrupted and you decline, and something else takes your place. And maybe that society later on, from the ashes, emerges and comes back. Well, eventually, Polybius says, and this is largely what I've got here in the slide, that Rome is able to avoid these things. And I've got the cycles of government here, where you can see that you move in a whole variety of different ways. If you look on the left here, you've got monarchy, you've got kings, so that an example of this would be the Etruscan kings, right, the Tarquins. But over time, those kings move from being enlightened to being tyrannical, and somebody is going to overthrow them, like Brutus did. That tyranny collapses, and then you get a small group of aristocrats who come to power. Those aristocrats rule for quite a while until eventually they too become corrupted. They form an oligarchy. People don't like the fact that these small clique of rulers are exerting too much power. They overthrow them, and you come up with something that is more akin to a democracy. Eventually, over time, though, that democracy gets corrupted. People overthrow it. They revert to what here is called an animal-like existence, or another way of thinking about it is anarchy. And what happens out of anarchy? One strong individual comes, and now you're back to kingship. Well, for Polybius, Rome doesn't have a kingship. They don't have an aristocracy. They don't have a democracy. Instead, they have a combination of all three of these things. They've got consuls, but they're limited in their terms. They've got a senate that is elected. They've got an assembly, which represents the interests of most of the common people. And because of those three combinations, and because of them coming together, what Rome has is actually not a single government, but actually all three governments rolled into one, and that's what's allowed it to be so successful. The other element that Polybius throws in here is a term I have on the first slide, tyche, or a loose translation of that would be fate. And there's a belief that since the First Punic Wars, fate had guided everything towards the merging of many different Mediterranean people into a single state system under Rome's leadership. And maybe another way to think of tyche is actually fortune. And so for him, he sees kind of the divine plan of fortune unfolding. And so what his job as a historian is to figure out how that has happened, why it has happened. How did we get here? Let's answer those tough why questions. So story, Rome from its low point to unity to now controlling the entire world. He actually adopts the Greek system of telling time by using Olympiads for chronology. Much like Herodotus, but even more so Thucydides, he acknowledges the historians who come before him, and like Thucydides, he criticizes them very severely, mainly about their accuracy, again, very much a Thucydides point of view. He thinks that most reliable accounts come from eyewitnesses. Like him, he was there. And he interviews lots of people in the Greek and the Roman world to get there. If we look at his purpose, it's also very much Thucydides based. He doesn't want to entertain people. He doesn't want to just look at old-timey things because they're fun. He argues, and this is a translation of his argument here, that history has to teach about life. So that might mean consoling some folks about why their life sucks because fate has struck them poorly. But it might also mean that it's going to teach people how to live an active public life, who can apply lessons learned from the past to the present, and who can figure out how can we keep Rome going the way that it is. His histories impact not a lot of people, but certainly the elite within Rome, probably most notably Livy, who we've already read and we've seen, who reads Polybius a bunch and models much of what he writes after them. Okay, enough there. If I can pause this. You can advance because apparently my mouse is not being helpful, and this video is going to keep going for a little bit.